Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared to learn it. He was just a skinny boy with cracked shoes and hungry eyes, standing on a dirt road in Barnwell, South Carolina, watching the world pass him by like he was invisible. The year was 1936. The boy was 3 years old, and the life stretching out in front of him promised nothing except poverty, silence, and the slow, grinding weight of a world that had already decided he did not matter. His name was James Joseph Brown, Jr. But the people around him mostly just called him Junior, when they called him anything at all. His father, Joseph Gardner Brown, worked whatever jobs he could find. His mother, Susie Bailing, was a young woman caught in circumstances no one should have to navigate alone. The house they lived in was not really a house. It was a shack. Thin walls, no insulation. Winter coming through the cracks like it owned the place. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and borrowed time. James would later describe those early years as feeling like the world had forgotten to put a floor under his feet. Every morning he woke up and had to find solid ground all over again. When James was 4 years old, his mother left. She did not leave a note. She did not say goodbye in a way that a 4-year-old could hold on to. She simply was there, and then she was not. James would spend decades trying to understand what that absence meant. He would write about it in ways he could not say out loud. He would scream it from stages in front of thousands of people without ever quite naming it. But it started there, in that shack, in that silence. When the person who was supposed to be the center of his world walked out and did not come back. His father, unable to manage both work and a young child, eventually sent James to live with his aunt, a woman named Handsome Washington in Augusta, Georgia. The name sounds almost like something from a novel, but the reality was grim. Aunt Handsome ran a boarding house in one of the roughest sections of Augusta, a part of town where poverty was not just a condition, but an atmosphere. You breathed it in. It settled into your clothes and your skin and the way you held your shoulders when you walked down the street. Augusta, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, was a city cut in two. On one side of the invisible line, there were paved roads and brick buildings and white families who went to church on Sunday and sent their children to schools with real books. On the other side, where James lived, there were unpaved streets and broken windows and children who learned early that the world had not been built with them in mind. James understood this division before he had words for it. He felt it in the way certain men looked at him. He felt it in the way certain doors stayed closed. But Aunt Handsome's boarding house had something that would change everything. Music. The men who rented rooms there, the workers and the wanderers and the men between jobs, they brought music with them the way other people bring luggage. They played guitar on the porch in the evening. They sang in low voices that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than their throats. They played rhythms on anything that made a sound. An old tin can, the wooden railing, the side of a wall. James sat nearby and listened with the kind of attention that children give to things they know matter, even if they cannot explain why. He was 6 years old when he first sat at a piano. It belonged to a neighbor, an older woman, who let neighborhood children come in and press the keys on Sunday afternoons. Most of the children banged at it randomly and ran back outside. James stayed. He pressed a key and listened to the sound decay. He pressed another and listened again. He was trying to figure out what the instrument was trying to say. Even then, at 6, he understood music as a kind of language. He just had not learned enough words yet. He had no money for lessons. He had no money for much of anything. And the clothes he wore to school were other people's clothes, handed down so many times that their original colors were a kind of mystery. He would later recall the particular humiliation of wearing shoes that did not fit properly, shoes that were too big or too small, shoes that announced to everyone around him exactly where he stood in the social order of Augusta, Georgia. It was the kind of humiliation that either breaks a person or builds in them a fire so hot it cannot be extinguished. In James Brown, it built the fire. He started shining shoes when he was around 7 or 8 years old. He would walk to the areas of Augusta where there was money, where white men in good suits moved between offices and hotels and restaurants, and he would offer to shine their shoes for a few cents. He was good at it, and he worked fast, and he worked thorough, and he had already learned, in the way that children from hard places learn early, how to make himself appealing to people who held the resources. He smiled when he did not feel like smiling. He said thank you when what he meant was something else entirely. Every cent he earned, he saved. Not in a bank. He had no access to a bank. He saved in a coffee can that he kept hidden in a corner of the room he slept in at Aunt Handsome's house. He did not spend the money on food, though he was often hungry. He did not spend it on better clothes, though he needed them. He was saving for something specific, something he had decided he needed the way other people need air. He was saving for a guitar. He had seen one up close for the first time when he was about 8 years old. One of the boarders at his aunt's house had brought one back from a trip, a beautiful old instrument with a warm brown body and steel strings that caught the light in a way James found almost hypnotic. The man had let him hold it for a moment. Just hold it, not play it. But James had felt something in that moment that he would spend the rest of his life chasing, a sense of possibility, a sense that this object was a door and that on the other side of that door was a version of himself that the world had not yet seen. He shined shoes for 2 years to save enough money for a guitar of his own. 2 years of early mornings and late afternoons, 2 years of bent back and aching hands, 2 years of smiling at men who looked through him, 2 years of counting coins in a coffee can by candlelight. When he finally had enough, he walked into a pawn shop on one of Augusta's main streets and bought the cheapest guitar they had. It was a battered thing, scratched and slightly out of tune, with strings that cut into his fingers until he bled. He did not care. He carried it home like it was made of gold. He taught himself to play by watching other people play. He had no instruction book. He had no teacher. He sat at the edge of wherever music was happening and he watched hands and he listened. And then he went home and tried to reproduce what he had seen and heard. He got it wrong 1,000 times before he got it right once. But getting it wrong did not discourage him. Getting it wrong was just data. He was building something, and he could feel the architecture taking shape even when it did not yet make sense. Around this same time, James discovered the church. The church in Augusta's black community was not simply a religious institution. It was the center of cultural life, the place where music and community and emotion all converged into something that was larger than any of its individual parts. James started attending services at a local church, and what he experienced there split his understanding of music into a before and an after. The preacher moved through the congregation like weather. The choir created sounds that felt like they were coming from the walls and the floor and the ceiling all at once. The call and response between preacher and congregation was the most sophisticated form of communication James had ever witnessed. A question asked, an answer given, another question, building on the answer. The rhythm of it was not just musical, it was structural. It was how meaning got made. He watched the way the preacher controlled the room, the way silence was used as powerfully as sound, the way a single change in volume could shift the emotional temperature of the entire space. He was not just listening to music. He was studying performance. He was studying the relationship between a person on a stage and the people watching that person. He was learning, without having the vocabulary for it yet, that the distance between a performer and an audience is not a gap to be managed but a bridge to be built, one sound at a time. By the time James was 11 or 12, he was performing wherever he could. He played guitar on street corners for coins. He danced for crowds of passers-by, moving his feet in patterns he invented on the spot, as drawing circles of spectators who laughed and clapped and threw change into a hat on the ground. He entered every amateur talent contest he could find. He almost always won, not because he was the most technically skilled performer in the room, but because of something he had that the other contestants lacked. Something that is very difficult to name but impossible to miss when you see it. He wanted it more. The other kids who performed in those contests were talented. Some of them were genuinely gifted. But for them, performing was a thing they did. For James, it was a thing he was. The stage was not a place he went to show people what he could do. It was the only place where the ground felt solid under his feet. Every other environment, school, the streets, the social world of Augusta, he involved navigating a system that had been built to exclude him. But the stage had different rules. On the stage, what mattered was whether you could hold the room. And James Brown, even at 12 years old, could hold a room. School was complicated. James attended a segregated school in Augusta with overcrowded classrooms and undertrained teachers and textbooks that were other schools' cast-offs. He was smart, and his teachers recognized it, but the system was not designed to catch smart boys who came from the places James came from. He missed days, sometimes weeks when he needed to work, or when circumstances at home made attendance impossible. He was eventually expelled, though accounts differ on the exact reason and the exact grade. What is not disputed is that his formal education ended before he was a teenager. The streets of Augusta filled the gap that school left open. James learned things on those streets that no classroom could have taught him, though not all of those lessons were safe. He fell in with older boys who had moved past petty mischief into actual crime. Augusta in the early 1940s offered few legitimate paths out of poverty for young black men, and some of the boys James ran with had already made their calculations about which risks were worth taking. James got arrested at 15 for stealing clothes from cars. He was tried as an adult and sentenced to a correctional facility called the Alto Reform School in Alto, Georgia. He was 15 years old. The Alto Reform School was not designed to reform anyone. It was designed to contain. The days were long and regimented, and the food was poor, and the guards moved through the facility with the kind of casual authority that comes from knowing they would face no consequences for how they exercised it. James spent years there learning, mostly, what it felt like to have your time controlled by other people, and what it felt like to want your life back with a hunger that was physical. But, even at Alto, music found him. There was a gospel group at the facility, a collection of inmates who had organized themselves into a small choir. James joined. He was not the best singer when he arrived. He was not the most experienced. But he practiced with a discipline that alarmed the other boys, the same discipline he had brought to the guitar, the same discipline he had brought to shining shoes. He practiced until his voice did what he wanted it to do. He practiced until the gap between what he heard in his head and what came out of his mouth started to close. It was at Alto that James met Bobby Bird. Bobby Bird was a young man from a family that was, by James's standards, practically wealthy. They had a house. His mother was warm and present. Bobby had grown up with a different set of assumptions about what life could offer. He was also at Alto, visiting a friend when he and James first connected. The two young men recognized something in each other immediately. Bobby heard James sing and could not stop listening. James saw in Bobby a kind of stability, a kind of groundedness that he had been searching for his whole life. Bobby Bird would become one of the most important people in James Brown's life, and he would eventually help get James released from Alto by vouching for him, by having his family agree to take responsibility for James once he was out. Bobby's mother welcomed James into their home in Taka, Georgia, the way not enough people had welcomed James anywhere. She fed him. She gave him a room. She treated him like he belonged. James Brown had never experienced that before. He was 17 years old and someone had given him a home. And so he played. Every day, every evening, every moment that was not claimed by work or sleep or the basic maintenance of staying alive. He and Bobby formed a group. They called themselves the Gospel Starlighters, and then the Tocoa Band, and then, eventually, something that would grow into the famous Flames. They played churches and school gymnasiums and small clubs and anywhere else that would have them. James was not the leader, not at first. He was one voice among several. But something was happening with that voice. Something was developing in the way he moved, in the way he related to an audience. He was learning to give himself over to the music completely. This is the hardest thing to explain about James Brown as a performer, even in these early years in Toccoa, Georgia, in the early 1950s. Most performers, even very good ones, maintain a kind of internal audience, a part of themselves that watches what they are doing from a distance and makes adjustments, modulates the presentation, ensures that the performance stays within certain boundaries of control. James was learning to turn that internal audience off, and he was learning to let the music do whatever it needed to do with his body, his voice, his sweat, his breath. This was not abandonment. This was a different and more demanding kind of control. It was the control of a person who trusts the river enough to stop swimming against it. He had no father at home to tell him how to be a man. He had no established community that had claimed him since birth. He had no institution behind him, no family name that opened doors, no safety net beneath the tightrope he was walking. What he had was this. What he had was a stage and a band and an audience and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that if he could hold the room, he could hold his world together. By 1956, the famous Flames had a regional reputation. They were playing dates across Georgia and into neighboring states, driving in a van that broke down more than it ran, carrying their own equipment in and out of venues that barely merited the name, sleeping on floors when the money ran out. It was not glamorous, but it was real. James was doing the thing, not dreaming about it, doing it. That same year, they recorded a song that James had been working on, turning over in his mind, building from a feeling that had been accumulating for years. The feeling of being nobody, being invisible, being dismissed, and then discovering that you had something inside you that the people who dismissed you would never be able to take away. The song was called Please, Please, Please. James had written it not so much as a composition, but as an outpouring. The words were simple, almost embarrassingly simple. Please. Just that word, repeated, stretched, pulled apart and reassembled, put through every emotional register a voice could find. The recording session was modest. The equipment was modest. The studio was modest. But the voice that came out of James Brown in that session was not modest at all. It was the voice of every year of hunger and every year of invisibility and every year of holding the room when the room did not particularly want to be held. It was the voice of a boy who shined shoes for 2 years to buy a guitar that cut his fingers until they bled. It was the voice of a boy whose mother left before he had words for what that meant, and who had been trying to find those words in music ever since. Please, Please, Please was released in March of 1956. It reached number 5 on the rhythm and blues charts. James Brown was 23 years old, and the world was starting to hear what he had been saying all along. But here is the thing about that success. Here's the thing that people who only know the legend tend to miss. The man who walked into that recording session was not someone who had been discovered, who had been found by the music industry and elevated from obscurity through good luck and good timing. He was someone who had built himself, piece by piece, year by year, from almost nothing, with almost no help, against almost every conceivable obstacle. The Augusta streets, the absence of his mother, the detention facility, the years of performing for rooms that did not always want to be won, the shined shoes and the coffee can and the battered guitar. Every single one of those things was in his voice when he sang. Every moment of humiliation, every moment of hunger, every moment of wanting something so badly that the wanting became its own kind of fuel. The world would eventually come to know James Brown as the Godfather of Soul, as the man who invented funk, as the hardest working man in show business. They would know the white suit and the cape and the dancing and the showmanship that made audiences feel they had not just attended a concert, but survived a natural event. They would know the voice that could go from a whisper to a scream, in the space of a single measure, and make both the whisper and the scream feel absolutely necessary. What they would not always see, what the lights and the legend and the years tended to obscure, was the boy in cracked shoes on a dirt road in Barnwell, South Carolina. The boy, who was 3 years old when the story started, who was 4 when his mother left, who was 7 when he learned to shine shoes, who was 8 when he bought a guitar with money he had saved coin by coin by coin in a coffee can hidden in the corner of a room in a boarding house in Augusta, Georgia. That boy never really left. He was in there the whole time, underneath the cape, underneath the sweat, underneath the screaming and the dancing and the precision and the power. He was the reason for all of it. He was the engine underneath the engine. He was what the music was about, what it had always been about, from the very first moment a small hand pressed a piano key in a neighbor's house on a Sunday afternoon, and listened to the sound decay and understood, without quite having the words for it, that something was possible that had not been possible before. James Brown did not become the Godfather of Soul. He built the Godfather of Soul. He constructed him year by year, instrument by instrument, stage by stage, out of material that most people would have found unusable, out of absence and hunger and humiliation and the particular kind of rage that comes from being told, in 1,000 different ways, that you do not belong anywhere. He took that material and he turned it into something that moved the world. And it started, all of it, with a boy who shined shoes to buy his first guitar. Nobody knew, back then, what he was building. Nobody saw the architecture taking shape in that coffee can, in those calloused fingertips, in those long nights practicing in a room that was not really his in a house that was not really his home. Nobody knew that the boy with the cracked shoes was going to walk out of Augusta, Georgia. He'd put his hands on music and shake it until it changed shape forever. But he knew. Somewhere underneath the hunger and the invisibility and the early morning cold and the shoes that did not fit, James Brown knew. He knew with the certainty of someone who has already decided, who has already made the agreement with themselves that whatever it costs, whatever it takes, however long it requires, the music is going to come out, the voice is going to be heard, the room is going to be held. He had been practicing his whole life for a stage the world had not yet built, and when the world finally built it, he was ready.